Hi, I'm Bumbleborn, and I want to talk about how I adapted my 3D platformer into a 2D Metroidvania for the Playdate. Before I get into it, I'll go over what the game actually is, so if it doesn't sound interesting, you can just carry on with your day. It's a 2D Metroidvania with zero combat and a focus on jumping puzzles, with a bit of lock and key design to manage the player progression. You play as a kid who has to take a scroll from a place called Bottom Rock all the way up through the Kingdoms 3 to the archives. This scroll has important information on it that might put a stop to the Blight, a mysterious disease that has petrified much of the sentient life in this world. Now, let's get into it. So back in June of last year, I realised I had two problems. I was working on a game called Echo's Climb. It's a dream game of mine that combines design ideas from Zelda and Dark Souls with the jumping puzzles of Guild Wars 2. But with it being 3D, it's a big world to create. It's going to have a bunch of characters, levels, music, and a few cutscenes. What I'm saying is, it's a lot for one person to do, especially when I also have a part-time job. My second problem is that because I've worked on a bunch of multi-year projects that have ended up getting cancelled or put on hiatus, I don't actually have a lot of work to point to that proves I can make games, or that players should be interested in a game that I'm making. If I'm going to put a few years into my own game that I have full control over, I need to learn how to market it, and I need to learn how to really finish a game. I learned a lot by making the Steam demo for Echo's Climb. I added leaderboards, controller remapping, functional UI, and other things like achievements that you always put off till later. But I didn't know how to market it effectively. The solution to these problems is simple, if not straightforward. I need to practice these two skills with less risk: finishing and marketing. I need to make a game, and I need to talk about that game. It has to be small, it has to be achievable in much less time, and it has to be somewhat marketable. It might also be cool to tie this new game into my 3D game, which could mean all the narrative and world building work, along with a lot of the mechanics design I do on it, is immediately relevant to the progress of the other game. To be quite honest, whilst I was thinking about all this, these goals weren't fully fleshed out until about a month into the project, but it makes me sound more confident to say it was always the intention. So I've been building a game called Echo the Oracle Scroll. It's so small that it could fit in the palm of your hand. Literally, I'm making it for the Playdate, a tiny yellow console with a crank. The Playdate is a ridiculously cool concept. I'm kind of shocked that it exists at all. When I first heard about it, I was reminded of the Ouya and how that kind of drove itself off a cliff. But based not just on the marketing, but the games that are being showcased for it, it looks remarkable. I also think it has really solid aims. It's not trying to compete with any other console. It's a unique concept that appeals to retro fans, hobbyist developers, and people who just like novelty gadgets. Whilst I think it's very expensive for what it is, and it lacks a few features that would make it much more desirable, like a backlight for instance, it definitely has a market, and part of that market is me. It also has a bunch of awesome tools to help people make all kinds of games for it. They made a website called Pulp that allows anyone to make a game without needing to write much code at all. And then there's the SDK that acts as a framework so you can build your games with Lua or C++. It also has really good documentation, which is huge for me. I'm very used to Unity's and Unreal's approach to docs, which is basically just a bad set of directions to places that no longer exist. I get it though, the Playdate has far less functionality as a console, which means there's much less to cover. That restriction does mean that you can put all of the documentation onto a single page, which is really nice to work with. Quality of life aside though, the Playdate hasn't sold that many units, so why would I choose this platform? If it's got such a small market, then isn't it a bad idea to spend more than a month or two making a game for it? Well, yes and no. It's got a much smaller audience than something like Steam, but it's a much more dedicated audience. It's got one of the best game dev communities that I've ever been part of, and people are extremely excited to see more games come to this console. I pre-ordered one way back in April last year, but I didn't start working on a game for it until I saw a video by Squid Dev on Playdate development. It showed me just how quickly I could get a game up and running, and that I didn't even need a console to start. I had this dumb little arcade game set up in a few hours, and from that point on, I was hooked. Then I saw his video called Making a Metroidvania for the Playdate. Now, full disclosure, I love Metroidvanias. I know it's not original, but Hollow Knight is probably my all-time favourite game. And I'm sure the sequel, Hollow Knight Silk Song, will also be one of my favourite games. It will come out, it will. I believe. I could talk for a long time about how and why the genre is so good, but there are about 1 billion videos already doing that, so suffice to say, this video was instrumental in getting me to make a Metroidvania. I'll link their video in the description where they cover making their game, The King's Dungeon. They also made a great video where they go into detail about getting a Metroidvania up and running on the Playdate in about an hour. It took me about 2 nights to make that much progress, but it was so much help on where to begin. I'd never used Lure before, and whilst I was fairly experienced in C# and Unity, just coding it directly and not having an engine or editor was a very new experience for me. So if I don't have an engine, what tools am I using? The main one I'm using to make the game is the Playdate Software Development Kit. It's filled with helpful libraries, but most of all it lets me compile the assets and code that I write into an executable that runs on the console. For the levels, I'm using what Squid recommends, the Level Designer Toolkit. This thing is just incredible. It was made by the lead designer of Dead Cells, Sebastian Bernard, and it's already gone through the full game dev cycle when they used it to make their game Nuclear Blaze. It's by far the best program I've ever used to make levels for a 2D game. It took a little bit to get used to, but the ease of adding new data to your custom setup makes progress super swift. For art and animation, I've mostly been using Sprite. It's the first time I've had a proper go at pixel art, but I'm having a blast. I also used Blender and a website called Playdate to make the main menu. It's not final, but it works really well for now. And then for the music, I'm using Ableton Live. For the sound effects, I'm using a website called Zapsplat to get the initial sound files and then editing them in Ableton. Finally, to make a custom font for the game, I'm using a thing called Caps, which is an online font editor that Panic released for free. Okay, so I've got the tools, the inspiration, and I'm ready to make this game. I started by making a few simple assets, some spikes and some player animations for running, idle, and being in the air. I based this character on the kid from the 3D game, and whilst they're canonically different characters, this should work to tether the 2 games together. I also made a cave tile set that uses LDTK's rule set system to automatically know what tile to place. I just paint the collision and the toolkit handles the rest. With all this helpful software and guidance that the community offers, the term indie game kind of feels somewhat dishonest sometimes. The real secret to making anything independently is standing on the shoulders of giants and loudly proclaiming that you did it all yourself and you deserve sole credit anyway. I was just getting started, so my player and game scene were very similar to what Squid had set up, but I quickly wanted to diverge mechanically. I was thinking about unique things that I could add to the game, and I came to the same conclusion every Playdate developer does. Oh yeah, it has a crank! I can add a crank in the game, and then players can turn the crank on the console, and then that will turn the crank in the game, and it will give us that crispy, diegetic gameplay hot off the grill. This also evokes a mechanic I really like from Zelda games, the pulley system that often triggers time-based challenges. I made a sprite for a crank, then I wrote out some pretty hacky code to set up a simple system for interactables that know if the player is near them, and if the player is nearby, then in its update loop, it listens to the crank. As soon as the crank is turning, it starts counting up. The general idea is that things can be connected to these cranks, but they handle what should happen when it gets cranked themselves. The plan is to make a whole group of interactables that use this crank system. The final piece of the puzzle was the crankedmover.lure. It's not really programming if you don't have terrible naming conventions. It just takes the crank's current crank value and linearly it lerps between an origin point and a transform point that I set up in LDTK. And with that, the game's done. I can ship it, I can start making money. In all honesty, it did feel great to get here. It felt like a successful adaptation of a game where timed jumping puzzles matter. The game now had timed jumping puzzles. I was only about a week in at this point and I could see that it would work as an adaptation. Once I decided this game was going to take place in the world of Echo, I had to figure out where and when. It couldn't just be a remake or a sequel, because that would ruin the story I was setting up for the 3D game. I settled on it being a supplemental prequel. It doesn't need to be played to figure out the story of the 3D game, but it will give you a deeper sense of the history of the world. I've always loved how Zelda handles its many different games, how Link is a fairly bland heroic figure that acts as a stand-in for the player, a link between worlds if you will. And it's cool how someone similar pops up at several points in time with a fate intertwined with their past and future incarnations. Since Echo is a mashup of Zelda and Dark Souls, it felt like a good direction to go in, and leaves the door open for me to potentially make future games that also have this same kind of character. The Oracle's Scroll takes place a few hundred years before Echo's Climb, where the blight that once forced everyone underground has begun to infect the Kingdoms 3, causing many people to begin to lose hope. Now I just needed a plot. I wanted something pretty simple that had the same kind of purpose where you just had to start at the bottom and climb to the top. I'm going with, a message has to be delivered, and as the Oracle's assistant and one of few who can still move around freely, you're given the call to action. It's up to you to climb through the many kingdoms and hopefully, maybe, help stop the blight. You might be a small part of this wider story, but you'll still have an impact on the future of this world. The general idea for this game world has always been the same. It's a bunch of Zelda dungeons stacked on top of each other. So you start in a normal cave, move through a fire cave, then through a forest cave, each with their own mechanics and goals. This will be a bit of a spoiler, but I'm going to go into the design and intention of each area, so you can see how I'm approaching a game of this size. I thought about if this is worth doing, and ultimately I think it's valuable to see how I'm building the progression path of the game, since that's the core part of what a Metroidvania is. I think for these vlogs I'll go through what's in the main path, but I'll never talk about the ending or any of the many secrets that will be littered throughout the world. First up, Bottom Rock, where the humans live. The player starts their journey here, completes a challenge for Lord Solus, and begins their climb through the Kingdoms 3. The mechanics are simple: locks, keys, mushroom trampolines, and cranks, with a few spikes thrown in as well. It's also where you get your first ability, the dash. Then we're off to Lava Lake, home to the frog-like Grog, where the Grog Prince Boulder wants you to heist a set of blueprints from the keep. This place is a little more dangerous, with lava and platforms that break beneath your feet. You obtain the Boom Boots ability here, which acts as a sort of double key. It lets you jump again with a little explosion, but that boom also breaks boulders, which lets you explore a bunch of new locations. This is where the game gets a little bit less linear. There'll be multiple new avenues for the players to explore with their newfound abilities and platforming skills. After helping the Grog Prince, you'll be able to go to the final area, the Undergrowth. An underground forest filled with plant life, and inhabited by the plant folk of the world, the Florane. It's a little in disarray though. The blight has spread throughout, causing blight weeds and blight bulbs to pop up all over the place. This has caused a lot of the local population to go into hiding, so I can get away with making less assets for this area. The player's going to have to do a bit of gardening and fix up the undergrowth to unlock the last area. Oh yeah, there is one more final area, but it's much smaller. It's called the Archives. It's a huge library that contains all the knowledge that was salvaged by the Three Kingdoms as they migrated beneath the royal core. This is where the game will end. Which segues nicely into talking about where the game begins. After that initial prototype, I planned on finishing the game fairly quickly, but we already know that didn't happen. What did I get done in June then? Well, first, I added locked doors and keys. With these in place, I can effectively design a bunch of levels with a form of progression and exploration. The game would be boring with just these though, so Metroidvanias have abilities, which really just work like advanced keys for doors that don't look like doors. This gap here? That's actually just a door. It lets you get up to this level up here. The key is an ability that allows the player to dash. Same thing for this high ledge. That needs a double jump. Arguably the best part of a Metroidvania is the feeling that you get when you combine these keys to get past ever more complicated doors, sometimes leading to entirely new areas. Allowing these abilities too early will really damage the feeling of leveling up. It'll end the game a lot quicker too. You want to slowly introduce these concepts in ways that provide novelty with the same mechanics. I don't have much practice breaking down game design academically, but I like to think of it as a three-step process. Problem, where you introduce a version of a locked door to the player. Workaround, where you provide a temporary key that solves a specific version of that problem. And then solution, where the player is granted a permanent way to solve that problem, anywhere, anytime. Let's look at a Zelda game for example. There's a bunch of use cases for bombs scattered throughout the world. But the designers know that bombs are a very powerful item, so they give them to you in those three steps. First, there's the problem. You'll encounter several situations like this big rock on outside island. Clearly it's important, but the player doesn't know why yet. Then later, we have the workaround. The bomb flower provides a temporary solution to that problem in localized areas. The player can now get practice solving that problem, but they can't do it everywhere. Finally, we have the solution. After a certain point, the game gives the player the bomb bag, which allows bombs to be used anywhere, including that big rock on Outset Island. Applying these steps to Echo, early on I have a high ledge that the player will try and fail to climb. Then for the workaround, we have a whole area filled with these mushroom trampolines that allows the player to solve that exact issue, but in a temporary way. Finally, we give the player a pair of boom boots, allowing them to double jump, solving that problem permanently. Making these keys feel a little different in how much height they give you is a nice way to break up what is essentially the exact same dumb mechanic of just player going up more. Then to round out this month, I worked on NPC interactions. Now I don't want anything too complex, the kind of NPCs that you'd see in top-down Zelda games or Pokemon games where they just say one or two lines to you. That'll suffice. But I might have a few that change what they say depending on your progress through the game. The next thing was a VFX system, which for most games would feature particles and shaders, but for the Playdate that's overkill. So I just have an animated sprite pop in, play to the end, and then delete it. I added VFX for the footsteps, the boom boots, and a leaf burst when you run through a bush. Finally, the 3D demo had this watchtower, so I wanted the main goal of Bottom Rock to be about climbing a tower. Completing this challenge will grant the player the first stamp of the Courier's Pass, allowing them to travel to Lava Lake. Oh, and speaking of Lava Lake, I added those brittle platforms I mentioned earlier. They fall apart when you stand on them, then respawn a few seconds later. It's a small mechanic that adds a nice little sense of urgency to platforming. I guess a lot happened in June. By the end of the month, I had a working inventory as well. The framework was in place. It was a Metroidvania, and it was pretty fun. Whilst it wasn't finished then, and still isn't finished now, I do think I've made a lot of progress. 2 years ago, I quit my job to make Echo's Climb, and after 4 months of hard work, I released a demo. It got played by a few streamers, I took it to a few events, and the feedback was pretty positive. But I had no idea how to move forward beyond that. Making a whole ass game is tough. Every single one takes a crazy amount of work to get out the door. I've gone part-time at my current job to work on this prequel, and whilst it's taken about 4 times longer than I planned, I can see that it's going to get finished. I think it's about breaking the steps down to make them as straightforward as possible. Making a whole Metroidvania sounds insane, but saying I'm just going to make one level and it's going to have a start and an end can make the mountains seem a lot less scary. It just takes one small step. That's the end of this episode, and I've got to say, my gosh, I did not expect the last video to do so well. It feels trite to say, but I am humbled by the support you've all given me. My goal was to hopefully get 50 to 100 views, so thank you so much for watching. I don't have a Patreon or anything, so for the credits I've just put the lyrics to All Star by Smash Mouth because it's a pretty good song. I'll be honest, this episode was tricky to make after such a positive reception. I knew I wanted a slightly different style to the other video, and I knew I wanted to make assets for explanations. Nearly wanted to make all the music for it, but I need to pace myself. Maybe in the future. I think this devlog is just going to use the kind of music that you'd see in loads of these kinds of vlogs. And then at a later date, maybe I can do music for one as well. On the next game. We'll do it on the next game. I procrastinated hard. It wasn't all bad. I watched a lot of X-Files and tried to make meaningful progress on my pixel art. The thinking being that when I enter the polishing stage, I can add a lot more charm to the game through better character portraits and animations. I don't think I'll be making an episode this long again, because I really do have to actually make the game. I was planning to cover all of development, but I might do a chunky time skip in the next one to catch up to present day, because there's a bunch of cool stuff I'm working on at the minute that I want to talk about, and it feels dumb not to, but I did want, you know, a kind of through line for this devlog series. Maybe I can do one a month where I spend 3 weeks on the game and then 1 week on the vlog, but this vlog has already stretched into the first week of Feb, so one might not drop now till probably March. But I mentioned that I'm going to do some smaller design and tech oriented videos as well. I've got one in the works, so we'll see. We'll see if one might drop a bit earlier. Thanks so much for watching to the end. It's absurd that you've watched this end bit as well, which is just me waffling, and this bit now where I'm just talking about you watching. It's wild. Honestly, like, just thank you so much. Bye. Linearly interplays.